I'm theoliverpickard and welcome to beautiful Limousin, France. This week I've been contacted by a gentleman named Mark who currently owns an American police car, of all things, and he's selling his American police car to buy a 2CV. So, Mark has asked me to do, in his words, an idiot's guide to buying a 2CV. Now, I don't know about that, but I can certainly do a guide to buying a 2CV. So, he wants my input, he wants my opinion, and here it is. I've been also asked the same thing by quite a few people for advice here and there, so I'm just going to try and condense it all into a video. So first things first, what car to buy? Well, in my opinion, I prefer the older 425 cars. A lot of the cars that have recently gone up in value massively have been late model Charlestons and stuff like that. And the reason is, anyone new to the 2CV world instantly gravitates towards kind of, oh, the last cars must be the best kind of thing. And they are the quickest, but not necessarily the best. And other cars get overlooked. For example, the early 70s Square Lights are fantastic cars, arguably much better quality than the last cars, and they are a percentage of the price, like literally less than half price. Dianes are incredibly cheap, they're incredibly good. But often overlooked are the 60s cars. I'm not talking about Jolene. Jolene's got suicide doors, which means she's worth a premium. I'd paid a premium for her. But cars after 1965 with a third window and normal doors and the new front end still have a 425 engine, and people are kind of scared of the 425 engines, and there's no need to be. Cars, if you're using it every day, you don't want to go for a 50s car or a really early 60s car, a 61 or a 62. If you're using it every day, then they're more of a weekend car, more of a collector's item kind of thing. They're just slightly too slow. They're incredibly robust, they're incredibly well built, but the 12 horsepower isn't really enough for every day, but 18 is. I'm testament to that. I drive an 18 horsepower car every single day. And the mid 60s cars are absolutely superb value, especially cars like the Azams and the Exports are beautiful quality. They are the luxury model of the time, and they have loads of features like I have an ENAC hatchback and the folding seat that I'm currently sat on. That makes my car incredibly usable and incredibly versatile. And these cars are quite a lot cheaper than some of the last 2CV6s, which, if I'm honest, I wouldn't even look at. Because they are such a high premium over kind of a Square Light. There's such a high premium over a Diane, and there's such a high premium over the mid 60s cars, and the mid 60s cars are my favourites. I looked at, as well as Jolene, I was very tempted when I was looking for a 2CV by an Azam Export, a Belgian-built 2CV from the mid 60s. With an utterly gorgeous, kind of shiny black interior and beautiful switchgear. Utterly gorgeous cars. And the Belgian cars tend to be kind of a bit more posh than the French-built cars. And the German spec 2CV6s are easy to spot because they have kind of adjustable back, like normal car seats because of German traffic laws. And they also have catalytic converters. So if you're in America and you're looking at getting a California legal 2CV, you either need to get one from the 70s or you need to get one that has cats on it, which is a German spec car. So if you're looking to import one into America, that's what you need. The best thing to do for a 2CV is to get one that's already there, in my opinion. They actually did American spec 2CVs in the 50s, which is super cool. But anyway, so yeah, no matter what your budget is, I will say this to you: look for cars that are the best you can get in your budget. So if you want a Charleston, for example, but you've only got £4,000, you're not going to get a really good Charleston for £4,000. You're better cutting your cloth to the size of your pocket. So you will get the world's cleanest kind of 2CV4, for example, which is perfectly usable. I have friends, in fact I was talking to a guy the other day who's driven all over Europe in his 2CV4, which is a 435 car. They don't sound quite as nice as the 425s, but they're a little bit faster. And they look like a 2CV6. I know I've met a gentleman who's driven across Russia in a 425 18 horsepower 2CV. The 425 cars, like Jolene, will cruise at 57 miles an hour, which is 90 kilometers an hour, which is more than enough to get where I'm going. I tend to use B roads anyway, but if you're on motorways and stuff a lot, then yeah, look for the best 2CVs that you can get in your budget. Not all 2CVs are the same, and if you are on an incredibly tight budget, then like I said, look at Square Lights, look at 2CV4s, and look at Dianes. A Diane was designed as a posher version of a 2CV6, and we're now at the point where they're like half the price, but they won't be for long. And they're an incredibly good car. I did a video with my car versus my parents' Diane, and although I love my car and there's a reason why I bought it, there is a heck of a good argument, especially for an everyday like drive to work commuter car, than a Diane. Another thing that I will say is cars that have recently just received tons and tons of work, I would be really skeptical of. I would always go for kind of an older restoration if I could. It's unless you're paying top money for an absolutely perfect car, which let's face it, not many of us are, you're going to need to do some restoration work. You're going to need to do some work of some kind. There are things that will need doing. For example, Jolene's paint is god awful, and I do need to repaint her. I'm really not happy with it. It's matte in some places, shiny in others, and satin in others. It's really bad. It looks like someone did it with their feet. So at some point, I bought Jolene with the knowledge that I'm going to have to repaint her. You will have to do something somewhere, and you know, she's not going to be perfect, but you can kind of limit horsefly. You can kind of limit the problems. For example, like I said, I wouldn't go for a car that's been tarted up before its sale. I'd rather go for something that's really honest, where I can see the problems, because you'd be amazed what a lick of a spray can hide. Kind of awful filler and stuff like that. A car that's had a recent respray, I would be very, very careful with. Cars that have had, like I say, recent work, loads of money poured into them, apparently, right before a sale, I would be a bit tentative of and really go over it. Like I said, the biggest enemy of a 2CV is rust. But before we get on to that, let's talk about the engines. When you look at a 2CV engine, it doesn't look like anything else. But the first thing to do is get on your back, get under the car, and have a look at the seam. The engine splits in two, and the crankcase seam runs all the way down the front. Now then, the crank is in the centre, that's where the fan is. Under that, and you can't really see it, is the cam. And the cam has no camshaft seal. So it's normal for there to be a little tiny trickle of oil, just like the slightest dampness or drip. But excessive oil means that the engine breather in the oil filler neck, that's on the front of the engine, it means that the valve in that, the rubber valve, has swollen up and isn't working, and basically it's blowing oil excessively simply because it's got nowhere else to go. It's not super bad, it's not terminal, you just need to replace that thing. The next thing I would do is dip the oil. Now then, on a 2CV, on an earlier car, there is no oil filter. The oil filter is actually located right behind where I'm pointing. It's on the back of the engine, on the left hand side, quite low down. It's underneath, kind of behind and underneath one of the cylinders. On a 2CV6 or a 2CV4, they've all got them. But the 425s don't. And if the oil filter has been maintained properly and changed properly, then the oil should be a nice honey colour. But as often is the case with 2CVs, the oil filter's a pain in the backside to get to. It's actually one of the most annoying service jobs. Many people take the wing off because it just makes things so much easier. But you want to dip the oil and check that the oil's a decent colour. If it's super black and awful, then obviously like the car hasn't been looked after. In a 425 2CV, there is no oil filter, and you have to change the oil reasonably regularly. So if you dip the oil in a 425 and it's super black and awful, and he says that he's changed the oil regularly, he might be lying. And the next thing on the list is to start her up. If you start her up and she clanks when you start her up, that could be a signal that the bores have been frozen in the engine because the car's been sat for a long time, and you're going to need to replace the cylinders and the pistons. It's not a huge job, but if you're paying someone else to do it, obviously man hours add up. And the thing with a 2CV is parts are cheap. But if that parts list is long, then it's still going to be expensive. Obviously, before you go anywhere, you're going to want to start up the engine and check everything's alright. If the engine is reluctant to start, it's obviously cause for concern. But coils on 2CVs are the weak point of the engine. So much so that people travelling a long way sometimes carry a spare coil with them. And the coil is right on the front of the engine, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's a seal for life component. Luckily it's cheap to replace, and they now do solid resin coils. If you are a 12 volt car. If you're a 6 volt car, then it's just like, I think they're about 15 quid for a new one. And spark plug wires kind of go corroded inside and old and stiff, and they can be replaced, and the spark plugs can be replaced, and usually kind of an ignition refresh will see the car running sweetly. They're not that complicated, like I say, as long as the carburetor is set up correctly. Jolene's carb wasn't set up at all correctly when we bought her, and she was running super rich and horrible. And once we got her set up right, she was utterly wonderful. But I did do a complete ignition refresh, same on my parents' Diane. But like I say, if it's reluctant to start up, that's usually the case. It's worth taking a multimeter or a voltage checker when you go to have a look at your car. If the car's sat and it's at idle and it's misfiring at idle, not when revved and cold, because they sometimes can, but when just sat idling, if it's misfiring slightly, if it's popping slightly, that could be the coil. But if you get your multimeter and you test the battery, if it's not full or it's not near full, if it's a 6 volt car, it should have at least 6.5 volts in it. If it's a 12 volt car, it should have well over 13. 6 volt cars will misfire if the voltage is low. If the battery is run down and it's not charging properly, because of either the voltage regulator, probably the voltage regulator, or the dynamo, then that's obviously cause for concern. Another thing you can look at is in the car. On earlier cars, there's an amp meter, but on 60s cars there isn't. But there is a charging light, and if that charging light, if you cover it over, they can be very dim. So if you're in a garage or something, it's better. If you're in a really sunny car park, that's very difficult. But if you cover it over, kind of lie down on the seat and look at that charging light. If that charging light is flickering while you're idle, that's a sign that the charging system might not be, it might be a bit tired and worn out and need either adjusting or going through completely, or a voltage regulator replacing. The voltage regulators on the 12 volt cars can go wrong, but they're like 6 quid. They're super cheap, whereas on a 6 volt car they're a lot more expensive, and a dynamo can cost you up to like a dynamo can cost you like 450 quid if you have to send it off and then get it back again, and it's obviously an exchange part. So that's cause for concern definitely with a 6-volt car. Most cars, the clutch system is relatively easy to in fact, compared to all other cars, the clutch on a 2CV is an absolute dream to replace, and can be done very quickly and very easily, and is reasonably economical to buy and sort out. But if you get a bit of scrunching from the gearbox when you set off, then that's an indication that the gearbox oil needs to be changed. And it's another indicator that obviously the last owner hasn't been taking quite as good care of it as he may lead you to believe. Although Jolene's needs doing now. You may have noticed the other day when I set off, I got a little bit of a scrunch in the video, and I need to change it. She hasn't actually been run since I've been working on the house non-stop. Haven't even left the land. So when you set off, like I say, if there's an annoying rattle from the shifter, that can be caused by the rubber mountings on the linkage. Don't worry, they're super cheap to replace, but it could actually also be caused by the tube itself, and the tube and the actual shifter linkage are a one-piece deal, and that would need to be replaced, and it is a super annoying rattle as well when they're worn, so you'll definitely notice it. It's not a very difficult job to do. You can do it at home, in your garage, even if you're not very experienced. Just take your time doing it. But it's a thing that you've got to pay for. So anything that you've got to do, you need to know these things. The brakes on 2CVs are pretty stout, as are the drive shafts and CV joints and all that. Early cars don't have, I think before 66, don't have CV joints, so they don't have as much lock in the steering, and at full lock they will go bada, bada, bada. And this is just because the drive shaft is kind of doing this. But that's not cause for concern, that's just the realities of that kind of generation of cars. Older 2CVs do that, especially in reverse. You don't want to reverse in a 2CV a long way, especially at speed, because the gearboxes can actually lock up. And disc brake cars have problems as well in reverse. There's some weird thing that can happen with the disc brakes in reverse. I don't know a lot about that. I don't have a disc brake 2CV. All I know is you don't want to reverse quickly in a disc brake 2CV. If the brakes squeak, especially the rear brakes, this is a sign that the brakes have either been rebuilt badly and not centered properly, or that they've used really cheap replacement parts. Brake pads don't have asbestos in them anymore. They did, obviously, when most 2CVs were built, and if they've been replaced with cheap pads and the drums are glazed, then things are going to need to be set up properly, and it's all going to need to be taken apart. The pads are going to need to be replaced, and it all needs, like I say, it all needs centering up properly, because drums use springs and stuff, and both of the drum pads have to be centered properly and all that jazz. If one's engaging before the other just because they haven't been set up right, then obviously that's an issue. The pads will be worn incorrectly and long before their time, and that's another thing that'll have to be sorted. But it's not a huge deal, and it's not very expensive. So you're on your test drive and you're driving along. Turn the heater on. The heater is controlled by some little rods on an earlier car, and it's one rod on a later car. And the rod on a 2CV6, I think, is a 3-position rod that does kind of a blower and a downward or whatever. On an earlier car, there's a little lever underneath the gauges, and that controls whether it's blowing up or down. If you put it on not Desgrange but the other one, chauffage, which is the foot blower, and you smell exhaust in a 2CV6, it's either the heat exchangers that run over the engine on the exhaust have rotted out, which isn't very likely, or it's because the cylinders that held onto the crankcase that I talked about earlier on a 2CV, there's no seals at the top or bottom. There's no head gasket and there's no kind of bottom seal on a 2CV. And if they need tightening, then you'll get a little bit of exhaust smell. If the cylinders need replacing and it's really bad, then obviously you're going to get a lot of exhaust smell. On an earlier car, it might be a bit oily. The reason for that is because there is no camshaft seal, and what can happen is the fan can blow the oil onto the engine, and because the engine's hot, you get a bit of an oily smell. I keep Jolene's engine super clean for this reason. And it might just be that it's an oily, khaki engine. It could just, in an earlier car, it could just be that you've got an oily engine and it all needs a good clean. And not necessarily the cylinders, although if the cylinders can get an exhausty smell, and an exhausty smell obviously is a very different smell to an oily smell. And if when you are driving, if you accelerate and then you let off, especially downhill, if you hear kind of popping and banging and that sort of thing, you've probably got a hole in the exhaust. On a lot of 2CVs, the exhaust can runs down the back here behind the engine. On a 2CV6 it does as well, although it goes over the top rather than going underneath on an earlier car. But that can's still there, and there's a pipe that goes off it on a 2CV6, and on a 425 it's just there. And they can rot away. In fact, they often rot away, and they often need replacing. And so just have a quick check, and if you can't see any holes, if it's popping and banging when you drive down a hill, it needs replacing. They're not very expensive to do it, but most garages, in fact all 2CV garages, will take the engine out of a 425cc 2CV to change the exhaust. It's just the easiest way. I've got a video where I keep the engine in and do it, so if you wanted to do it yourself you could do, just follow my video. But exhausts often need replacing. Now for 2CV6s they do a stainless steel one, which is kind of cool, so you might want to opt for that. It might be a chance to upgrade rather than a nuisance. You're on your test drive, it doesn't matter whether it's raining or not, turn on your windscreen wipers. They should make a nice purring noise and a little tiny kind of clack of the armature that's behind the dashboard. If they are super noisy and awful, there's a good chance that the spindles are worn. Worn spindles on a 2CV, the wiper spindles that run through the body, it's kind of a big deal, because what can happen is water can get in. If you grab the spindle and just give it a little bit of a shake, there should be a tiny bit of a play in, but not much. And this can show that if there's a lot of play in it, then the spindles are worn, the spindles need replacing. It's not an expensive job, but it does take a while and it's kind of annoying to do. But the problem with that is that when it rains, because the spindles are kind of looking at the sky, they tend to fill up with water, and that brings water into the car, which isn't good at all. It's a common leaking point for 2CVs, and like I said, they'll need replacing. The last thing is, go around the car and lock every door and open every door. Door locks on 2CVs can wear out. Luckily they're not expensive, but you want to know that they all work. So make sure you go, take the keys around the car, check every door lock works and actually locks. If they don't, they need replacing. You can buy a full set of door locks, and they're not a lot of money, but it's one of those things. Now then, on to the biggest problem with 2CVs, and that's rust. Earlier cars are made of much tougher stuff. However, later cars can rust like crazy. But whether an earlier car or a later car, it's really important that you check them thoroughly. So, first things first, because it's the easiest thing to check, go into the boot, and if there's a carpet or whatever, or if there's a spare wheel in there, pop that out and check along that edge. If there's rust there, that's an issue. You can buy the whole panel as one big panel, but obviously it's going to require quite a lot of welding. The fuel tank's there, so the fuel tank's going to have to come out. It's quite a big job. Check obviously exterior. Is there any obvious filler? Is there any where rust has been obviously covered up? The rear light panel on 2CV6s can often rust. If you check places that often get rubbed, places like around the wings and stuff like that, here is quite a common place for rust, as is kind of the edges of wings. Wings are quite expensive, as are bonnets, as are doors, because they're all one piece. So make sure you check those. The biggest issue with rust really in a 2CV is the chassis. Now, the chassis on a 2CV is hollow. It's kind of two chassis rails like this. If you turned it up like that, it's two chassis rails and some end pieces, and inside there's a bunch of kind of tubes on their end, and two sheets that hold everything together. And it's absolutely impossible for a chassis like that, of that design, to be watertight. So if there are signs of rust on your chassis, kind of on the joints where those flat plates attach, that's cause for concern, and you may want to think about a replacement chassis, because even though the outside can, oh, there's a spot here and there's a spot there, and oh, there's a bit down here, and oh, I could just weld it. The problem is that they rot from the inside out. So no matter how bad it is on the outside, it's going to be worse on the inside. Bear that in mind. The same for the sills. A common place is kind of at the back of the doors, kind of on a 2CV6. There's a piece here where the door lock's attached to, and at the bottom of that often rusts out where it meets the bodywork. And another place to check is where the chassis meets the body at the front, this area. If you go in and you lift the carpet up, what can happen is there was a felt strip that went in between the body and the chassis. This is another reason why, like I say, your chassis is kind of an unknown quantity, especially if it's rusty. If it's beautiful and it's been really well taken care of, and you can check, or it's been replaced recently, then you kind of know. Like Jolene's chassis is just perfect. Chassis can fail massively if they are rusted through, and if they do crack. Early chassis legs can crack, and that can cause this here to become kind of apart from itself. You should be able to draw a nice line through there, and the bonnet should fit well. And like I say, all this area here, this should be all nicely lined up. If it's not, there's a chance that the chassis could be slightly bent, and if it's even slightly bent, it needs replacing. Like I say, your chassis is quite an unknown quantity, and that's an issue if you look at it and it has kind of rust where seams meet seams and things like that. That's a little bit of surface rust here and there isn't a bad thing. It can be cleaned off, and it can be painted, and it can be rust treated, and that's not a problem. But when it's where seams meet, if your chassis is going to rot, it's going to rot from the inside out. As with any cavity in any car of any age, when you have rust on the outside of a cavity, especially where seams are, that's where it's rusting, and it's rusting from the inside out. Any really good restorer or anybody worth the salt will actually cut that away and replace that section of bodywork. But when it's a chassis, replace the chassis. It's not worth not doing. Another place that gets rust is on a 2CV6, the panel that runs up here, where the rear doors hinge to and the front doors latch to. It tends to get rust at the bottom. Any sills, anywhere where bodywork attaches to the body, because the bodywork actually attaches with holes. You're going to really want to check all of that. Make sure you check the bottoms of your doors, because doors are very expensive. As are bonnets, although bonnets, it's a 2-minute job to replace it, other than painting it. They are expensive to buy, but like I said, doors are very expensive, especially on the super early cars. They'll have to be repaired rather than replaced. The very first A's have a different door that has to be completely taken apart, and it actually has to be brazed together. So, but the later wrinkle bonnet doors and on all the AZs and these doors this is the same door as an AZ, I think. and the doors on the 2CV6s and 2CV4s are readily available but expensive. You want to check around the windscreen seal, which is another rot spot, and around the gutter where the vent is. Open the vent and have a look inside, and if there's signs of rust, that could be an issue, because obviously that's water going in your car. If there's a carpet or floor mats or anything, make sure you pull them up inside and you have a look down, and where the kind of footwell curves down here, where it meets the floor, that's a common rot spot, because like I said before about the windscreen wipers, you can get water in, or you can get water in through the vent, which sometimes happens, and that can pool there and rust away the floor. Check underneath, just any like odd spots, anywhere where panels meet panels, inner wings, things like that. A common rot spot on these earlier cars is where the panel actually folds over. It folds over to a bead. There's a kind of a bead inside it, and water can get stuck in there and rot the panel away from the inside. But yeah, just give it a really, really good once over. And like I say, I would personally buy a car that has a completely frozen engine, where it won't turn over at all and it hasn't run in years, and the mechanicals completely need redoing, but is completely rust free, over a rusty running car that's like super rusty. A friend of mine sent me a car the other day, and I think it was $3,000. It was a dolly, I think, and it looked like it had been in the hole at the bottom of the sea. And he's like, but it's got a new chassis, and I'm like, I don't care. To get that car to a perfect stage, even if all the mechanicals are spot on, with all the rust involved, you could end up spending $10,000 if you're going through tradespeople and you're paying for it to be restored. That could get very, very expensive very, very quickly. If you're buying a car from Spain, or you're buying a car from a hot place, a lot of the rubber seals are going to need to be replaced, things like windscreen seals, rear window seals and stuff like that. If you're importing a car, bear in mind that all the rubber will perish. If you're getting a car out of a barn and it's a barn find, I've done a video on restoration versus preservation and stuff like that in the past, so you might want to check that video out. But don't let all this put you off. I'm kind of worst case scenario looking around the car, and like 2CV panels aren't very difficult to replace. There is quite a lot of welding involved, but compared to most other cars, it's not that hard. If you're going to take on a serious restoration, a 2CV is not a bad serious restoration to take on. Although, like I say, always buy the best possible car within your budget. So if you're looking at a 2CV6 Charleston, and the only thing that you can buy is a ratty 2CV6 Charleston, look elsewhere. Look at something else that's a lot less money. Get a Diana or something like that, that is well within your budget, and you can buy a really, really good one for your budget, because you will get just as much joy out of that as you would one that's painted a different colour. And 2CVs are massive fun no matter what year they were made, no matter when they were made. And so don't be afraid of the 18 horsepower 425 cars from the 60s. I know in the UK they're few and far between, but there are plenty of them around. And like I said, just be very honest with yourself about what your budget is, about what you are willing to spend, because like I say, unless you're paying top money, there will be some restoration needed, but you can choose what that restoration is, whether it's body new chassis, or whether it's kind of towards the mechanical side of things and just going through everything and replacing the odd seal and stuff like that. With Jolene, I've had to go through her charging system. I've had to replace all the ignition stuff. That's normal on a 2CV. Expect to fit a new coil, expect to fit new plug wires and new plugs, a new condenser, and a new ignition box. It's not expensive, but it's something that you should definitely expect to do. Check your tyres, your dates on your tyres, because if you are looking at Michelin X's, they can be 100 quid each. So that's 400 quid on your on the price of your buying your car. If it's got good tyres on, as it is, then awesome. But if they are dry cracked, if they are knackered, if they are bulging, if they are kind of awfulness, then you're going to need to replace them, and sooner rather than later. If you're getting a car of a barn, you're going to need to do a complete brake overhaul because the seals will have broken down on the wheel cylinders. Like a barn project is very different to a car that's been driven. Cars that sit deteriorate just as fast as cars that get driven. It's a myth that putting a car in a barn and not using it, or in even a warm, nice garage and not using it, doesn't mean it doesn't deteriorate. They do. And buying a car from a museum is an absolutely huge prospect, and it's just the same as restoring a car, because every single rubber seal will need replacing, and those cylinders will need replacing, and the engine will need completely going through, and everything will need changing, just the same as if you got it out of a barn, even though it's not rusty. So just bear that in mind. Have a look at all the fuel line runs down the side here, and have a look at all the fuel line. Check the flexi hoses and things like that. Check for cracked flexi hoses. A flexi hose is a couple of Jubilee clips and like 10 minutes. It's not a huge job, but they do need doing. Like I said, check the fuel line, check the brake lines. 2CVs do need the correct sort of brake fluid. You can't just shove any old brake fluid in there. I think it's LHM brake fluid, so that needs to be the correct sort, otherwise you'll end up with deteriorating seals and all sorts. But yeah, 2CVs are massively reliable cars if they are correctly looked after, and if you look for the right thing to begin with. If you buy the right car to begin with, the right car for you, then that's absolutely fine, and you'll have years and years and years of absolute joy. They can even be fun to work on. You know, you can actually see it as a good thing that they need a bit of work. And Jolene's 56 years old this year, and I know many 56-year-old people that could do with a bit of work. So just think of it like that. You know, she's an old lady, and even the last 2CVs now are what were they, 1990, 29 years old, and many of them in better shape than I am. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you know someone who will find this video interesting or informational or useful, please make sure you pass it on to them. If you like this video, please make sure you click like down below. It helps me massively. It lets YouTube know I exist. If you're not subscribed to this channel, 75% of people who watch my videos are not subscribed. Please make sure you subscribe. It's a massively important thing that massively helps me. I don't want your money, just want your support. Supporting this channel is as simple as that. If you have any comments or concerns or questions, please leave them down in the comments below. I always make sure I read all of your comments, and I've been posting nice comments on social media because everyone who leaves a nice comment, often people on YouTube only concentrate on the negative comments, which is very easy to do when someone's not saying something very nice about you, but the people who leave lovely comments often get forgotten about and don't get the attention they deserve. So I've actually been posting your nice comments on my Twitter. If you go down in the description, there's all my social medias and stuff there. So if you want to find me, if you want to email me, if you want to whatever, all my stuff's down there. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Please be awesome to each other, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye bye.